The steel was bleeding light when Commander Reth Vaswar arrived at the summit. Not the slow, patient luminescence his advanced team had described in their initial survey report. Not the faint thermal signature the orbital sensors had flagged 3 days ago, the one that had drawn his cruiser out of its patrol corridor and into orbit around this frozen, forgotten world. This was active, rhythmic. A pulse of deep violet radiance pushing through cracks in stone that should have been solid, splitting the carved surface of a pillar that had stood on this mountain plateau for longer than any civilization in the compact had kept records. Reth climbed the last of the broken steps 2 at a time, his boots grinding ancient masonry to powder, and stopped at the edge of the ruined plaza. His breath plumed in the thin air. Behind him, 26 members of his security detachment fanned out across the shattered flagstones, weapons drawn, scanning the perimeter with the professional wariness of soldiers who had been told this site was dormant and could see with their own eyes that it was not. "I want a perimeter at 40 meters, Reth said. His voice carried the flat authority of a man who had commanded frontier garrisons for 3 decades. "Nothing approaches the steel without my direct order." The plaza was enormous, 200 meters across, ringed by the collapsed remnants of walls that had once stood 30 meters high, their surfaces still bearing the faded traces of carved symbols that no one in the compact's xenolinguistic database could read. At its center, the steel rose 15 meters from a base of fitted stone blocks, tapering to a blunt apex that caught the pale morning light of the world's distant yellow sun. The stone was dark, not quite obsidian, not quite basalt, something between, with a crystalline grain that fractured light into prismatic edges when you looked at it from certain angles. The carved glyphs covered every visible surface, thousands of them, running in vertical columns from base to apex, each one precise, each one deep, each one cut with a tool that left no ragged edge and no working mark. And now they were lighting up. Not all of them, not yet. But a cluster near the base, roughly at chest height on a standing figure, pulsed with that deep violet glow, and the pulse had a rhythm that Reth's combat instincts read as something uncomfortably close to a heartbeat. "Commander," Lieutenant Pale, his senior field officer, approached at a cautious jog, her scanner held at arm's length like a shield. She was tessarine tall, lean, with the pale gray skin and wide dark eyes of her species, and she handled frontier anomalies with the kind of cold professionalism that Reth valued above almost every other quality in a subordinate. "The advanced team's instruments are returning anomalous readings. The energy output from the pillar has increased 400% in the last 6 hours. Whatever triggered this acceleration, it started approximately 90 minutes before we entered orbit." "Before we arrived?" "Yes, sir. The timing is suggestive. The science team believes our orbital insertion may have triggered a proximity response." Reth studied the steel. The violet glow pulsed, steady and patient and utterly indifferent to the armed soldiers surrounding it. "Or it knew we were coming." Pale said nothing to that. She was too disciplined to speculate aloud. But Reth caught the flicker in her expression, the tightening around the eyes that said she had already considered the same possibility and did not care for it. The world was listed in the compact's navigational archives as KV 1173. No atmosphere worth breathing, no indigenous life above the microbial level. Mean surface temperature -42 degrees in the equatorial band, colder at the poles. The kind of world that civilizations flew past without slowing down, the kind that survey teams cataloged in a single orbital pass and never visited again. Except that someone had visited. Someone had come here, in some unrecorded era so distant that the compact's best dating instruments struggled to calibrate against the mineral decay, and they had built this plaza, these walls, this steel. They had carved thousands of glyphs into stone that resisted every analytical tool Reth's science team had brought to bear. And then they had left, and everything had gone quiet for a span of time that the preliminary isotopic analysis estimated at somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years. Until now, Reth's orders were clear. Secure the site, assess the artifact, determine whether it represented a threat to compact shipping lanes, and report to regional command. Standard frontier protocol for anomalous pre-compact technology. He had run similar operations a dozen times across his career: derelict stations, abandoned orbital platforms, the occasional sealed bunker on a dead moon. Every one of them had been inert, cold, the engineering equivalent of a fossil. This one was awake. Set up a command post at the north wall, he ordered. Full environmental monitoring. I want atmospheric composition, radiation levels, and seismic readings every 15 minutes. Pale, get me everything the advanced team has on this pillar: material analysis, glyph mapping, energy signatures, the full package. And find out why none of their reports mentioned that it was doing this. The advanced team's final report was filed 11 hours ago, Commander. The steel was dormant at that time. Then something changed. He walked closer to the steel, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from the illuminated glyphs. It was subtle, not the blast furnace heat of an industrial process, but the gentle, directed warmth of a system designed to operate in the presence of living beings. The violet light played across the front of his uniform, catching the insignia of the compact Frontier Corps, and for a moment he had the unsettling impression that the light was examining him, reading him, deciding what he was. The advanced team had consisted of 12 researchers and 4 security personnel, all compact species: Tessarine, Drevani, Vethani, 2 Cathari. Standard mixed species composition for a frontier survey. They had spent 9 days on the surface, documenting the ruins, mapping the plaza, taking core samples from the steel's base. Their reports were thorough, methodical, and uniformly boring. The steel was old. The stone was unusual. The glyphs were undecipherable. The site showed no signs of habitation or maintenance in at least 300 millennia. Recommendation: continued monitoring via orbital sensor, no immediate follow-up required. Then 11 hours ago, the steel had begun to glow. Reth did not believe in coincidences. He believed in cause and effect, in evidence, and in the fundamental principle that ancient things did not spontaneously activate without a trigger. Something had changed. Something had arrived, or something had been disturbed, or something in the steel's incomprehensible programming had reached a threshold that 300,000 years of dormancy had been counting toward. The violet pulse quickened. 2 more glyphs ignited, higher on the pillar, their light brighter than the first cluster. The stone hummed a low, bass vibration that Reth felt in his jaw and his sternum, the kind of frequency that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the skeleton. Commander, pale again, her voice clipped. We're picking up a new energy reading. Below the plaza, deep 200 meters, possibly more. The seismic sensors are showing a void structure beneath us. Large, potentially the size of the plaza itself. Natural. Geometric. The void is rectangular. The walls are uniform. It's artificial, Commander. Reth looked down at the flagstones beneath his boots. Ancient stone, cracked by ice and time, held together by nothing but the precision of its original fitting. Somewhere beneath it, something the size of a cathedral sat in the dark, connected by unknown means to the pillar that was currently pulsing violet light into the thin mountain air. Double the perimeter. Nobody enters the plaza without my authorization. And get me a ground-penetrating scan of that void. I want dimensions, access points, and any energy signatures. He turned back to the steel and stood before it, arms crossed, studying the glyphs the way he would study a hostile formation on a tactical display. The light pulsed. The stone hummed. The mountain wind cut across the plateau with a sound like breathing. What are you, he thought, and what do you want? The answer, when it came, did not come from the steel. It came from the maintenance bay of Reth's cruiser, the Ascending Vigilance, in orbit 200 kilometers above the plateau, in the form of a request so mundane that it nearly got lost in the morning's operational traffic. Civilian technical specialist Dale Harron, human, age 53, attached to the Ascending Vigilance on a 6-month maintenance rotation, had filed a standard materials requisition for replacement seals on the port side atmospheric recycler. Appended to the requisition, in the notes field where most technicians wrote things like urgent or see previous work order, Harron had written a single sentence. Requesting permission to examine surface artifact, the energy signature matches a pattern I've seen before. The requisition sat in the operations queue for 40 minutes before Pale flagged it and forwarded it to Reth's field terminal. Reth read it twice. Then he pulled up Harron's service record. Human, born on a colony world called Brannock's Landing, one of the smaller human settlements in the outer trade corridors. No advanced degrees. No research credentials. 29 years of service as a maintenance technician across various compact vessels, atmospheric systems, hydraulic systems, power distribution, the invisible infrastructure that kept warships functional while the officers who commanded them rarely thought about it. His performance reviews were uniformly adequate. His disciplinary record was clean. His security clearance was the standard rating for civilian technical staff. Low enough that he had no access to classified systems, high enough that he could move freely through the ship's mechanical spaces. There was nothing in the record that explained how a maintenance technician would recognize an energy signature from a 300,000-year-old alien artifact. "Bring him down," Reth told Pale. "Shuttle under escort. I want to talk to him before he goes anywhere near this thing." Pale hesitated for exactly 1 second, the hesitation of an officer who had a question she was too disciplined to ask but not disciplined enough to suppress entirely. She asked it anyway. "Commander, if the artifact is responding to proximity, bringing a new biological variable onto the surface is a risk. Noted. Bring him down." The shuttle landed on the plateau's eastern shelf 40 minutes later. Harron descended the ramp with the unhurried gait of a man who spent his days navigating the cramped corridors of a warship's engineering deck, slightly stooped, careful with his footing, hands loose at his sides. He was unremarkable in every physical dimension. Medium height for a human, medium build, brown hair going gray at the temples, deep set, eyes the color of weathered slate. He wore his standard-issue maintenance coveralls, the fabric stained at the cuffs and knees with the permanent marks of hydraulic fluid and atmospheric sealant. A small toolkit hung from his belt. He looked exactly like what his file said he was. A competent, undistinguished technician who had spent 3 decades keeping things running. Reth met him at the edge of the plaza, with Pale and 2 armed guards flanking the approach. The wind had picked up. The distant sun threw long, cold shadows across the flagstones, and the steel's violet glow competed with the daylight, pulsing steady and visible even at 100 meters. "Specialist Harron." "Commander." Harron's voice was quiet, the kind of voice that didn't carry in a room unless the room was paying attention. He stood at something that wasn't quite military attention, respectful, unhurried, the posture of a man who understood hierarchy without being defined by it. His eyes moved past Reth to the steel, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, not excitement, something older and quieter, like a man hearing a piece of music he hadn't heard since childhood. "Your requisition note," Reth said. "You claim this energy signature matches a pattern you've seen before." "Explain." "I said it matches a pattern I've seen, Commander, not that I've seen this specific signature." "The distinction." "The distinction is that what I've seen are records, old ones. On Brannock's Landing, where I grew up, there's a geological formation called the Cairn Ridge. Basalt columns, natural formation, but they've got markings on them, carvings that nobody ever identified. My grandmother used to take me out there when I was a boy. She'd been a mining surveyor before she retired, and she kept personal logs of every anomalous formation she found in 40 years of survey work. One of her logs described an energy pulse she'd measured at the base of the cairn ridge, a very specific frequency pattern. I memorized that log when I was 12 years old. Reth waited. Heron's gaze was still fixed on the stele, on the violet glyphs pulsing in their steady, living rhythm. The man's hands hung still at his sides, but Reth noticed that his right hand, the dominant one, judging by the heavier callousing, had curled slightly, the fingers closing around nothing, the unconscious gesture of a man reaching for a tool. When your advanced team survey data came through the ship's general information feed, I saw the energy readout. The frequency pattern is identical, Commander. The exact same waveform, the exact same intervals, the exact same harmonic structure. Whatever is happening on this mountaintop is connected to a set of basalt columns on a human colony world 1,100 light-years from here. Pale looked at Reth. The glance was brief, professional, and loaded with the same question Reth was already asking himself. Was this man telling the truth, or was he delusional? Your grandmother's logs, Reth said. Are they verified, published? No, sir. She kept them private. The mining company she worked for wasn't interested in anomalous formations. They wanted ore yields and structural assessments. The logs are in a personal archive on Brannock's Landing. I have copies aboard the Vigilance. Why? Heron looked at him. The slate-gray eyes were steady, calm, and entirely without guile. Because she asked me to keep them. She told me when I was 13 that someday the pattern would show up again, somewhere else, and that when it did, someone from our family should be there. Reth's suspicion crystallized into something hard and definite. This was either a man with genuine knowledge of a connection between two sites separated by 1,100 light-years and an incomprehensible span of time, or it was a man with a family mythology he had mistaken for fact. Either way, he was now a variable in an already unstable situation, and Reth's training told him to control variables. You will remain under escort at all times. You will touch nothing without my explicit permission. You will answer every question I ask, immediately and completely. If at any point I determine that your presence here is a liability, you will be returned to the ship and confined to quarters. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, Commander. Then show me these copies. The logs were on a personal data tablet, battered and scratched, the kind of device that a mining surveyor on a frontier colony world would have carried in a hip pocket for decades. Heron produced it from his toolkit with the practiced ease of a man retrieving a wrench. The screen was cracked in one corner. The casing was held together with maintenance tape. But the data was clean, organized with the meticulous precision of a career surveyor, and when Heron pulled up his grandmother's energy readings from the cairn ridge, Reth saw immediately why the man had made his claim. The waveform was identical. Not similar, not analogous, identical. The same frequency, the same amplitude modulation, the same harmonic intervals, recorded 41 years ago by a mining surveyor named Essa Heron on the surface of a colony world that had been settled by humans for barely 2 centuries. The overlay was perfect. Pale ran the comparison on her military-grade analytical suite, and the correlation coefficient came back at 0.9997. That's not possible, Pale said very quietly. Reth said nothing. He was watching Heron, who was watching the stele. The violet glow had intensified since Heron's arrival on the surface. 2 more clusters of glyphs had ignited, higher on the pillar, and the bass hum had deepened to a frequency that made the loose stones on the plaza floor vibrate against each other with a soft, continuous chatter. Reth did not believe in coincidences. The stele had been dormant for 300 millennia. It had begun to glow 11 hours ago, when the ascending Vigilance entered orbit. It was glowing brighter now that Heron was on the surface, and the rate of intensification was accelerating. He set a guard at 3 meters from the stele and ordered continuous biomonitoring of Heron. Heart rate, respiration, neural activity, skin conductance, every measurable physiological parameter, logged second by second. If the artifact was reacting to the man's presence, Reth wanted data on the interaction from both sides. The basalt columns on Brannock's Landing, Reth said, were they ever investigated, formally? No, sir. Brannock's Landing is a mining colony. Population 12,000. The Geological Survey Office has 3 people on staff, and their budget covers mineral assessments for the extraction companies. Anomalous markings on a basalt formation don't generate revenue. The cairn ridge is classified as a natural feature of no commercial interest. But your grandmother didn't think it was natural. No, Heron's voice was careful, measured, and there was a quality to it that Reth was beginning to recognize the tone of a man selecting his words with the care of someone who has rehearsed this conversation in his head for decades and is determined to get it right. She thought the markings were artificial. She thought the energy readings indicated a dormant system of some kind. She filed 3 reports with the survey office recommending further investigation. All 3 were denied for lack of funding. She tried the Regional Academic Council. They referred her to the compact Xenoarchaeological Registry. The registry sent back a form letter explaining that anomalous formations on colonial worlds with no established pre-settlement history did not meet the threshold for investigation. So she was dismissed. She was ignored. There's a difference. Being dismissed means someone looked at your work and found it wanting. Being ignored means no one looked at all. That landed. Reth heard it land, felt the weight of it in the pause that followed. He was a military man, not a scientist, but he understood bureaucratic indifference. He had seen good field reports disappear into administrative queues, had watched competent officers' warnings go unread until the situation they warned about became a crisis. And she told you the pattern would show up again. She told me the pattern was part of something larger, a network, she called it. She believed the cairn ridge was one node of a system that extended far beyond Brannock's Landing. She didn't know how far. She didn't have the resources to find out. She was a mining surveyor, Commander. She spent her career measuring ore deposits and mapping fault lines. But she was meticulous and she was honest, and she recorded what she found. The wind shifted. The morning sun, pale and distant, cleared the eastern ridge and threw new light across the plaza. In the daylight, the violet glow of the steel's glyphs took on a deeper quality, less like illumination, and more like something bleeding through from behind the stone, as though the carvings were windows into a space where light behaved differently. Reth gestured Pale closer. Assessment. Pale kept her voice low. The data correlation is genuine, Commander. I've run the comparison 4 times with different calibration protocols. The waveforms are identical to a degree that eliminates coincidence. Either this man's grandmother fabricated data using information she could not possibly have possessed about an artifact she could not possibly have known existed, or the connection between the 2 sites is real. And the artifact's response to his presence. Also genuine. The energy output has increased 23% since he arrived on the surface. The increase began within 4 minutes of his shuttle landing. I've isolated our team's biosignatures from the sensor data. No other individual on the surface is generating a correlated response. It's him specifically. Why? Pale was a scientist before she was a soldier. She answered the way scientists answer questions that terrify them, with precision and without pretending the answer made sense. I don't know, Commander, but I recommend we find out under controlled conditions rather than wait for the artifact to show us on its own terms. Reth made a decision. It was not the kind of decision that would appear in his official report, because it was based not on evidence or protocol, but on the instinct of a man who had spent 30 years reading situations and the people in them. Heron was telling the truth. The man's calm, his specificity, The battered tablet with its 41-year-old data, none of it had the markers of fabrication. This was not a delusional technician chasing a family myth. This was a man carrying information he had never expected to use, offered voluntarily because it was relevant, with no apparent personal agenda beyond an old woman's dying request. "Walk with me," Reth said. They approached the Stele together, Reth and Heron side by side, Pale and the escort 3 paces behind. The plaza flagstones crunched under their boots. The wind carried the faint ozone scent that the advance team had noted in their reports, the signature of ionized air around an active energy source. At 10 meters, the Stele's hum became audible even through the wind. At 5 meters, Reth could feel it in his teeth. At 3 meters, the boundary his guards had been holding the violet glyphs were bright enough to cast distinct shadows behind them on the plaza stones, and Reth noticed something he had not seen from farther away. The glyphs were arranged in pairs. Each illuminated symbol sat beside another of similar shape but different detail, like facing pages of an open book. "Paired notation," Heron said quietly. "My grandmother's columns had the same structure. Left-right pairs, each pair slightly different. She thought they were instruction and response. One side states a condition, the other side states what happens when the condition is met. If-then logic. That's what she called it, yes." Reth studied the nearest pair. The left glyph was angular, aggressive hard lines and sharp terminals. The right glyph was flowing, curved, almost organic in its shapes. Condition and response, question and answer. He could not read them, but the structural logic was clear even across an impossible gulf of time and species. "Commander," Pale had her scanner raised and her face had gone pale even for a Tessarine. "The subsurface void, it's changed." "Changed how?" "The energy readings from below are increasing. The void structure is generating its own power signature, now the same waveform as the Stele, the same as Specialist Heron's grandmother's logs. The correlation is identical across all 3 sources. And there's a thermal bloom. The void's ambient temperature has risen 9 degrees in the last 4 minutes. Whatever is down there is warming up. 3 nodes, a mountaintop pillar on a dead world, a basalt formation on a human colony, and now something beneath their feet in a chamber that was coming alive. The same pattern, the same frequency, the same harmonic structure, separated by 1,100 light-years and 300,000 years, speaking the same language. "It's responding to him," Pale said. She was looking at Heron, her scanner tracking the energy output in real time. The rate of increase corresponds to his proximity. When you approached the Stele, Commander, there was no change. When Specialist Heron approached, the output jumped 18%. At current acceleration, the system will reach full activation within the hour. Reth felt the professional calm he had maintained all morning develop its first crack. He was a soldier. He understood threats, he understood tactical situations, and he understood the chain of command. He did not understand an artifact that had ignored every species in the compact for 300 millennia, and was now responding to the presence of a maintenance technician with no credentials and a dead grandmother's survey logs. Specialist Heron. His voice was harder now, the command voice he used when situations moved from unusual to dangerous. "Step back from the Stele." Heron stopped. He was at arm's reach of the carved surface, close enough that the violet light painted his face and hands, and turned his gray maintenance coveralls into something almost ceremonial. He turned to look at Reth, and his expression was not defiance or eagerness or the glazed intensity of a man caught in a delusion. It was patience, the deep, quiet patience of a man who had carried something for 40 years and was finally standing in the place where it was meant to be delivered. "Commander, I understand your concern, but I don't think stepping back will change what's happening. That's my decision to make." "Yes, sir. But look at the glyphs." Reth looked. The violet glow had changed. The paired notations he had identified, the condition and response structure, were no longer static. The left glyphs, the angular ones, the conditions were dimming. Slowly, one by one, they were going dark. The right glyphs, the responses, were brightening. The answers were lighting up. The Stele was reading conditions and finding them met. What conditions? Reth demanded. What is it checking? Harren shook his head slowly. I don't know the specifics. My grandmother didn't know either. She could read the structure but not the content. She just knew that the left side was the question and the right side was the answer, and that one day the answers would light up. And that day is today. Because you are here. Because someone from the pattern is here. Not me specifically. Someone who carries the frequency. He held up the battered tablet. My grandmother measured this waveform in her own body. It's there, Commander, in her biometric data. A resonance frequency in the cellular structure of her bones. She thought it was an instrument error at first, a 67 Hz standing wave in her skeletal structure that no medical scan could explain. She found the same frequency in me when I was 8 years old. She found it in my mother. She found it in a cousin she hadn't spoken to in 20 years, everyone in the family line. The same frequency, the same amplitude, hardwired into the mineral matrix of the skeleton. The plaza went quiet. Even the wind seemed to pull back. You're telling me, Reth said very carefully, that this artifact is responding to a frequency in your bones. I'm telling you that the same frequency exists in this stele, in the basalt columns on Brannock's Landing, and in the skeletal structure of my family line going back as far as we have medical records. 3 generations that we can measure. I'm not claiming to understand it, Commander. I'm reporting what the data shows. Reth turned to Pale. Can you verify that? Pale was already scanning. She ran the biosensor suite across Harren at 3 meters distance, her mouth set in a thin line, her fingers moving across the scanner with the precision of a musician tuning an instrument she trusted more than her own ears. When the results populated her display, she stared at them for a long time. There is a standing resonance wave in Specialist Harren's skeletal structure, 67.4 Hz. The harmonic profile matches the Stele's output and the Cairn Ridge recordings within the same tolerance band. The correlation is, she paused, rechecked. Commander, this is not an instrument artifact. The resonance is biological. It's embedded in his bone mineral matrix at the molecular level. I've never seen anything like it. It's not a pathology. It's not a contamination. It reads like a structural feature, as though his bones were grown around that frequency. Grown around it, Reth repeated, engineered. I cannot confirm that conclusion from a field scan, Commander. But the implication is consistent with the data. The stele pulsed brighter. Another cluster of condition glyphs went dark. Another set of response glyphs blazed to life. The paired logic was cascading now, running up the pillar like a diagnostic sequence reaching the end of its checklist, and the hum had deepened again, a bass note so low it was more felt than heard, traveling through the flagstones, through the soles of their boots, through the bones of every person standing in the plaza. Reth had spent 30 years making decisions under pressure. He had held defensive positions against superior forces, negotiated with hostile civilizations, and managed crises in deep space, where the nearest reinforcement was a week's travel away. He trusted his judgment because it was built on evidence, and he trusted his instincts because they had kept him alive. His evidence said, the stele is responding to this man. The data is clean. The correlation is beyond coincidence. His instincts said, this is not a threat. This is a door that has been waiting to open. His suspicion said, how does a maintenance technician happen to be aboard my ship when a 300,000-year-old artifact decides to wake up? Specialist Harren, did you request this posting, the ascending vigilance, this patrol corridor? No, sir. Standard rotation assignment through the Civilian Technical Bureau. I go where I'm sent. I've been on 11 different ships in 29 years. The Bureau assigns based on maintenance needs and staffing gaps. I filed no preference for this vessel or this corridor. And the timing, your ship arriving at this world this moment. Harren looked at the stele. His face was calm, but Reth could see the weight behind his eyes, the accumulated weight of a lifetime of carrying something that no one had ever asked him about, that no one had ever taken seriously, that he had maintained the way he maintained atmospheric recyclers. Quietly, competently, because it needed to be done, and because someone had to do it. My grandmother told me that the pattern had its own timing, that when the conditions were right, the nodes would begin to wake, and someone carrying the frequency would be near enough to hear. She didn't say it was fate. She said it was engineering. Very old engineering, designed by people who planned on scales that we can barely comprehend. She said it the way she said everything, like a surveyor reading a geological report. Not mystical, not prophetic, just factual. The system was designed to activate when the variables aligned, and the variables included a carrier being within proximity. The engineering handled the rest. The engineering handled the rest, Reth repeated. He heard his own voice and barely recognized it. The commander's tone was still there, but underneath it was something else, the beginning of the shift that Harren's calm, factual delivery was slowly, inexorably producing in him. Not belief exactly. Not yet. But the first loosening of the framework that said this couldn't be real. He looked at the stele. The cascade was approaching the top of the pillar now, condition glyphs darkening, response glyphs blazing, the whole surface transforming from a pattern of dormancy into a pattern of fulfillment. The violet light was so bright that it competed with the daylight, painting the entire plaza in hues of purple and white. Reth made his decision. Touch it. Pale turned sharply. Commander. The artifact is already active. It's already responding to his proximity. It's already accelerating toward full activation on its own timeline. Either we control this interaction or we watch it happen on the artifact's terms. Specialist Harren, place your hand on the stele. Slowly. If anything happens that threatens the safety of this team, I will order an immediate withdrawal. And I will not hesitate. Understood. Understood, Commander. Pale, full sensor array on the stele and the subsurface void. I want real-time data on everything: energy output, seismic activity, atmospheric changes, electromagnetic emissions. Guards maintain positions. Weapons at ready but not aimed at the specialist. We are observing, not attacking. He paused, then added, for his own benefit as much as anyone else's. We are observing. Harren stepped forward. The violet glow brightened with each step, the response glyphs blazing in sequence, the hum deepening until the plaza stones vibrated and the loose rubble along the collapsed walls began to shift and settle. Pale's scanner emitted a continuous stream of data tones. The guards held their positions with the rigid discipline of soldiers trained to stand steady in situations they did not understand, which was the most dangerous kind of discipline because it held until it broke. Harren reached the base of the stele. He stood before it for a moment, looking up at the 15-meter column of carved stone with its thousands of glyphs, now almost entirely illuminated, the conditions dark, the responses blazing, the whole pillar a vertical cascade of violet fire in the pale morning light. He raised his right hand. The palm was calloused, scarred across the base of the thumb where a hydraulic line had burst 7 years ago, stained at the fingertips with the permanent marks of a career spent in maintenance bays and crawl spaces and the functional underside of civilization. It was the hand of a working man, a technician, a nobody. By every measure, the compact used to rank the importance of its citizens. He pressed it flat against the stone. The stele went white. Not violet, not gold. Pure, clean white, the color of light before it learns to be anything else, and it erupted from every glyph simultaneously, a blinding, total illumination that turned the plaza into a single flat plane of brilliance, and sent every shadow racing outward to the ruined walls and beyond. The hum became a chord, a deep, resonant, three-note harmony that Reth felt in every bone in his body. A sound that was not heard but inhabited, that filled the chest cavity and the skull and the spaces between thoughts. Pale stumbled back a step. Two of the guards dropped to one knee, not from impact but from the sheer sensory weight of the activation. Reth stood his ground by an act of will that cost him more than he would ever admit. His eyes narrowed against the brilliance, his hands clenched at his sides. The ground beneath them shifted. Not violently, not an earthquake, not a collapse. A settling. A mechanical adjustment, precise and calibrated, as though enormous gears deep below the plaza were engaging for the first time in 300,000 years. The flagstones vibrated, then steadied. Something vast and buried exhaled, a release of pressure or time or patience, and a seam appeared in the plaza floor 20 meters south of the stele, a straight, clean line in the ancient stone, running east to west, perfectly geometric. The seam widened. Stone slid against stone with a grinding, resonant sound that was somehow not violent, somehow not threatening, somehow exactly right, the sound of a mechanism performing the function it was built to perform. It was the sound of a door opening, a door that had been designed to open exactly like this, exactly at this moment, with exactly this degree of deliberate, earned ceremony. A ramp appeared. Cut stone fitted blocks, a smooth descent into the earth, and from the darkness below came light, the same white luminescence, steady and warm, illuminating walls of carved stone that stretched downward and outward into a space that the ground-penetrating scans had called cathedral-sized, but that Reth now realized was much, much larger. Harren's hand was still on the stele. His eyes were closed. The white light surrounded him like a second atmosphere, and his face held an expression that Reth had never seen on a maintenance technician or on anyone else in 30 years of service. It was not ecstasy. It was not revelation. It was the look of a man who had been listening to a hum in his bones for 53 years and had finally heard it resolve into meaning. "It's a record," Harren said. His voice was quiet, steady, carrying the same unforced calm it had carried since he stepped off the shuttle. A living record, not just data, a maintained archive. The stele is the access point. The chamber below is the repository. And the pattern, the frequency in my bones, in the cairn ridge, in this pillar is the key. A key to what? Harren opened his eyes. They were still slate gray, still quiet. But there was something behind them now that had not been there before, a depth, a recognition, the look of a man who has picked up a tool he didn't know he was built to hold and found that it fits his hand perfectly. Everything, Commander, everything they left behind. The chamber beneath the plaza was not a cathedral. It was a library. Reth descended the ramp with Harren at his side and Pale and 8 guards behind them, their boots marking a cadence on stone that had not felt footsteps in 300 millennia. The white light grew as they went deeper, emanating not from any visible source but from the walls themselves, carved stone panels that radiated a steady, even luminescence, bright enough to read by, gentle enough to work under for hours without strain. The air was warm, clean, faintly charged with the ozone scent of active energy systems, and dry, impossibly dry for a subterranean chamber, as though the humidity itself had been engineered out of the space. The ramp leveled out into a circular chamber 300 meters across and 40 meters high. Reth stopped at the threshold, and for one of the very few times in his career, his breath caught. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with carved glyphs, not the paired notation of the stele above, but continuous text, columns of symbols running vertically in tight, precise rows, covering every available surface in every direction. Thousands of columns, millions of individual characters. The chamber was a document, a single, continuous, incomprehensibly vast document written in stone by hands that had been dust for longer than most civilizations had existed. And it was moving. The lowest glyphs, the ones nearest the floor, were changing. New symbols were carving themselves into the stone surface as Reth watched, the stone parting smoothly to accept each character as though the rock itself were soft, as though the writing were as natural as growth. The chamber was still recording, still writing, still maintaining its record after 300,000 years of unbroken operation. "Dear gods," Pale whispered. It was the first unprofessional thing Reth had heard her say in 3 years of service. At the center of the chamber stood a second structure, a ring of 12 stone pillars, each 3 meters tall, arranged in a perfect circle around a raised platform of dark, polished stone. The pillars were carved with the same glyph system as the walls, but their symbols pulse slow, rhythmic, alive. Not violet now, and not white. Gold. A warm, deep gold that filled the center of the chamber with a quality of light that felt ancient and deliberate and patient. "The active core," Heron said. He was looking at the ring of pillars with the expression of a man arriving at a destination he had imagined for 40 years, and finding it exactly as described, not because he had guessed well, but because the description had been precise. "My grandmother's models predicted a central nexus, a place where the pattern consolidated. She drew diagrams in her survey logs, 12 points around a central axis. She worked it out from the Cairn Ridge Formation geometry alone, with nothing but a surveyor's transit and a compass, 12 columns. She was right. Your grandmother never saw this place. No, she never left Brannock's Landing. She worked the mines until she retired, and she died in the house where she was born. But she understood the pattern. She understood it the way a maintenance technician understands a system, not the theory, not the mathematics, but the function. What it does, why it does it, how to keep it running." Pale was scanning the walls, the pillars, the platform, the self-inscribing glyphs, her face cycling between scientific astonishment and professional focus, with a speed that Reth found almost comical under the circumstances. "Commander, the glyphs on the walls are actively changing. The inscription rate is approximately 1 character per hour. The oldest glyphs at the top of the walls date to the same period as the stele, 300,000 years or more. The newest glyphs at the bottom were inscribed within the last 72 hours. This archive has been continuously recording for the entire duration." "Recording what?" "I can't read the script, sir, but the volume of data is," she trailed off, staring at her scanner's estimate of total character count. "Commander, there are more individual glyphs in this chamber than there are words in the entire compact central archive, by several orders of magnitude." The weight of that number settled over the chamber like a physical thing. 300,000 years of continuous writing, every hour a new character, every day 24, every year nearly 9,000. Over 300 millennia, the count reached into numbers that made the compact's entire accumulated knowledge look like a footnote. Heron walked toward the ring of pillars. Reth did not stop him. He found to his own surprise that he could not. The suspicion that had driven him since the morning, the professional wariness, the commander's instinct to control and contain, had not vanished. It was still there in the back of his mind, a standing guard at the door of his judgment. But it had been joined by something else, something he did not have a military term for, something that felt like witness. He was watching a man walk towards something that had been waiting for him, not metaphorically, literally. 300,000 years of continuous operation, maintaining a record that no one could read, generating a signal that only one biological frequency could answer, distributed across a network of nodes that spanned at least 1,100 light years, all of it running, all of it waiting, all of it patient beyond any patience that Reth's species or any species in the compact had ever demonstrated. And the man walking toward it was a maintenance technician, a man who fixed atmospheric recyclers, a man whose highest qualification was a vocational certificate in pressure systems management, a man whose hands were calloused and stained and scarred from a lifetime of work that no one noticed or valued or thought about until it stopped being done. The ring of pillars brightened as Heron entered their circle. The gold light intensified, casting his shadow in 12 directions at once, and the three-note chord shifted, deepened, expanded, adding harmonics that Reth could feel in his sternum like a second heartbeat. The raised platform at the center began to glow along its edges, white lines tracing geometric patterns in the dark stone, and from deep below the floor came a vibration that felt less like machinery and more like breathing. Heron stepped onto the platform. The chamber responded. Every glyph on every wall pulsed once, simultaneously, a single heartbeat of white light that illuminated the entire 300-meter space in one flash, bright enough to leave afterimages on Reth's retinas. The 12 pillars around Heron blazed gold, their carved symbols rotating, reconfiguring, cycling through arrangements faster than the eye could track. The platform beneath Heron's feet became a display, a projection surface, Reth realized, recognizing the function if not the technology, and images began to form in the air above it. Not holograms, something denser, something more real, something that occupied space in a way that light alone could not. Projections of places, landscapes, a world with blue oceans and green continents, seen from orbit, so sharp and detailed that Reth could make out individual cloud formations and the glint of sunlight on water. Then closer, cities, structures, infrastructure complexes of stone and engineered crystal, connected by visible lines of energy that pulsed with the same gold frequency. Then closer still, people, beings, figures that were unmistakably humanoid, upright, bilateral, five-fingered hands, moving through spaces that were clearly engineered, clearly advanced, clearly the product of a civilization operating at a technological level that the Compact had not yet achieved and might never achieve. Humans, Pale whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the sustained chord. Commander, those are humans. Reth stared at the projection. The figures were human, or something so close to human that the distinction was academic. They moved through vast complexes of stone and light, working at consoles of carved crystal, walking through corridors lined with the same glyph system that covered the walls around him, standing before structures that looked like the steel above, larger, active, connected by visible lines of energy to networks that span a planet, and then a system. And then, as the projection pulled back to a wider scale, a web of nodes scattered across a spiral arm of the galaxy. 300,000 years ago, Reth said. His voice was flat, disbelieving, the voice of a man who has been handed a fact that demolishes his understanding of history and is not yet ready to let the old understanding go. Humans didn't exist 300,000 years ago, not as a spacefaring species. Not as anything more than. Commander, Heron's voice from the platform. It was calm, it was steady. It carried no triumph, no vindication, no "I told you so." It was the voice of a man standing in the center of an answer he had carried the question of for 4 decades, and finding it exactly as burdensome and exactly as right as he had always known it would be. They didn't stop existing. They stopped being visible. They built the network, they encoded the record, they seeded the frequency in their descendants' bones, and then they withdrew. Not because they failed, not because they were conquered, because the record was the point. The archive, the living document. They were the record keepers, that's what they were. That's what they built all of this to maintain. The projection shifted. The human figures were no longer working at their consoles and walking their corridors. They were gathered, hundreds of them, then thousands standing before a single massive stele on a plateau that could have been this plateau, under a pale sky that could have been this sky. One by one, they placed their hands on its surface. One by one, the glyphs responded. And one by one, they turned and walked away into a landscape that slowly, over the span of the projection's accelerated timeline, lost its cities, lost its infrastructure, lost everything except the stone and the signal and the frequency humming in the bones of the people who had carried it forward, generation after generation, through 300,000 years of forgetting. They left because the archive didn't need them anymore. It only needed someone to come back and read it. The projection cycled. Star charts bloomed above the platform, dense with data, not the compact's charts, not any chart Reth had ever seen, but something older, something more comprehensive, mapping not just the positions of stars but the compositions of their planets, the trajectories of their development, the rise and fall of ecosystems measured across geological time. Planetary surveys followed atmospheric compositions tracked across millennia, ocean chemistry, tectonic activity, the slow dance of continents and ice sheets, recorded with an observational patience that no living civilization possessed. And species. The archive had recorded species, not just cataloged them, watched them. Tracked their development from first spark of sentience to spacefaring civilization to decline, each trajectory logged in its own column of glyphs on the chamber walls, each story written in stone by a system that cared enough to pay attention and patient enough to never look away. Reth stood at the edge of the ring and watched. He was a commander. He had a duty to report. He had a chain of command to satisfy. He had 26 soldiers on the surface and a cruiser in orbit and a set of protocols designed for situations exactly unlike this one. But the steel above them was blazing white against the morning sky, and the 12 pillars were singing their 3-note chord, and the walls were still writing, and the man on the platform was standing in the heart of a record that had been maintained with a fidelity and a patience, and a devotion to the simple act of preserving knowledge that made every archive Reth had ever visited, every library, every database, every compact repository look like a child's notebook. "What does it say?" Reth asked. The suspicion was gone, not suppressed, not overridden. Gone, replaced by something he had not felt since he was a young officer standing on his first ship's bridge, looking out at the depth of space for the first time, and understanding that he was very small and the universe was very large, and that both of those facts were acceptable. Reverence. The genuine article. Not the reverence of ceremony or tradition, but the reverence of encountering something real and vast and earned through 300,000 years of continuous, patient, invisible work. Harren was silent for a moment. The projections cycled above him world after world, age after age, the long, slow, meticulous record of a galaxy observed by people who believed that the act of recording was the highest act of service. Everything, Harren said, every star, every world, every species that rose and fell, every ocean that formed and dried, every mountain that lifted and eroded, every migration, every extinction, every first fire and last breath, 300 millennia of the galaxy's life, written down by people who understood that knowledge is the only thing that outlasts everything else. And they built it to last. They built the stone to write itself. They built the frequency into their own bones so the key could never be lost, only forgotten. And they trusted, across 300,000 years, they trusted that someone carrying the key would eventually come back and open the door. And they chose maintenance workers to carry it. Harren looked at him, and for the first time he smiled. It was a small, private, weary smile, the smile of a man who had maintained a secret the same way he maintained pressure seals and atmospheric recyclers and hydraulic lines. With care, with patience, with the understanding that the work was invisible and essential, and that its value was measured not in recognition, but in the simple fact that the system kept running. They were maintenance workers, Commander. That's what record keepers are. You maintain the record, you keep it running. You make sure the systems stay functional and the data stays clean and the archive stays accessible. It's not glamorous work. Nobody builds statues to the people who keep the lights on. It's not the kind of work that earns ranks or titles or recognition. It's the kind of work that you do because if you don't, everything that was learned is lost. Every observation, every measurement, every story, gone. He looked up at the walls, at the millions of glyphs still slowly writing themselves, at the record still updating, the archive still alive after 300,000 years of silent, perfect, unwitnessed maintenance. My grandmother understood that. She maintained drill rigs and survey equipment on a colony world nobody had heard of, and she kept a set of logs that nobody wanted to read, and she passed them to me because that's what you do. You pass it on. You keep the record. And when the door finally opens, you walk through it, not because you're special, but because you showed up and the key fit and the work needed doing. The chamber hummed. The gold light pulsed. The 12 pillars stood like sentinels in their ancient circle, and the projection above the platform cycled onward world after world, age after age, the galaxy's long story told in light and stone by the people who had been there first and had cared enough to write it down. Reth stood at the edge of the ring and watched. He was a commander, and he would file his report. He would notify regional command. He would manage the diplomatic implications, the scientific expeditions that would descend on this site, the political complexities of a discovery that rewrote the history of every species in the compact. He would do his duty, because that was his maintenance, the system he kept running. But first he stood, and he watched, and he let the record play. Above them, on the mountaintop, the steel blazed white against the pale sky, a beacon visible from orbit, a signal that had waited 300 millennia for the right hands to answer it. In the maintenance bay of the ascending vigilance, Harron's empty workstation sat as he had left it, tools laid out in order, replacement seals stacked beside the recycler casing, a half-finished work order glowing on the terminal screen. Everything in its place, everything maintained, the small, invisible work of keeping things running, performed by a man who understood that the greatest archive in the galaxy and a ship's atmospheric recycler followed the same principle: tend it, maintain it, keep it alive, pass it on. The steel pulsed once more, and then the light steadied to a sustained, warm glow that would not dim again. The glyphs held. The record continued. Somewhere, 1,100 light-years away on a colony world that the Compact's bureaucracy had classified as unremarkable, the basalt columns of the Cairn Ridge hummed at 67.4 hertz, answering the call of a pillar they had never seen, connected across the void by a frequency that ran through stone and bone, like the oldest maintenance schedule in the galaxy, kept by the people who understood that some things are too important to let anyone forget. The archive was open. The keeper had come home,